In 1912, a discovery was made in Boston that would forever alter the way we view the intersection of science, ethics, and humanity. Imagine, if you will, being a witness to the unexpected, the moment when an ordinary man's brain, long believed to have been lost to time, was found preserved under highly questionable circumstances. A relic of a forgotten past, encased in a jar, its secrets frozen in time, waiting to be uncovered. It was the brain of a man whose life and death had been entwined with the very darkness of early 20th century medical experimentation. But the truly disturbing element wasn't just the preservation itself. No, the most unsettling aspect was that this man had never given consent. His brain had been removed, dissected, and stored without his knowledge, without the approval of his family, and without any ethical consideration. This is where the story begins, not with a simple scientific breakthrough or a heroic tale of discovery, but with a morally dubious act shrouded in secrecy and questions that remain unanswered to this very day. In an era where the boundaries of science were being pushed at a rapid pace, where the desire for knowledge sometimes eclipsed humanity's basic respect for the individual, this incident became a symbol of the dangerous potential lurking in the shadows of scientific ambition. To understand the magnitude of the discovery, we must first imagine the world of 1912. It was a time of rapid progress and scientific curiosity. Medicine, for all its advances, was still in its infancy compared to modern standards. The mysteries of the human body were just beginning to unfold, and the scientific community was rife with experimentation. This was an age where science was often seen as a religion in itself, revered and respected, but also capable of staggering ethical missteps. Neurology was one of the most exciting fields at the time, with pioneers like Santiago Ramon y Cajal beginning to reveal the secrets of the brain. Yet, as they reached for the stars of discovery, they often overlooked the moral implications of their actions. The demand for understanding the brain, what it was, how it functioned, how it could be preserved for future generations, grew stronger. But in this pursuit, it was too easy to forget the humanity of the individuals involved in these experiments. And so, in the middle of all this, a man's brain found itself as nothing more than a tool for scientific advancement. It was removed without consent, dissected, preserved, and hidden away from the public eye. No questions were asked, at least not loudly enough to be heard. The act itself, of cutting open a man's skull, extracting his brain, and preserving it for study, wasn't new, but this case would be one of the most disturbing examples of the disregard for human rights in the pursuit of scientific glory. The brain, now encased in a glass jar, would later be discovered, almost by accident, tucked away in a forgotten corner of a Boston medical facility. But what came to light wasn't just the gruesome preservation of human tissue. It was the story of a medical world in which the lines between right and wrong were increasingly blurred. The discovery was a shock to the system, forcing the public to confront the uncomfortable reality that science was sometimes willing to cross moral boundaries in the name of progress. And as investigators began to piece together the story of this preserved brain, they realized that there was far more to it than just a simple case of scientific curiosity gone too far. Who was the man whose brain had been preserved without his consent? What had his life been like? Was he a criminal? A scientist? A mere patient? No one knew for certain. What was clear, however, was that his body had been used as a tool in a deeply controversial experiment. The scientists behind this act, it seemed, had been motivated by a blend of scientific zeal and moral indifference. At the time, few seemed to question the practices that would now be considered unethical, even barbaric. The idea of obtaining a preserved brain for study was seen as a necessary evil in the pursuit of knowledge. But it was not until years later that the full extent of the violation became apparent. The man's brain wasn't just a piece of tissue. It was a window into the moral dilemmas that faced the scientific community at the time. Was it ethical to preserve the brain of a man who had never agreed to such a thing? Was the pursuit of scientific knowledge worth the violation of his body? These are the questions that would swirl around this discovery, but they were not the only ones. The very nature of the discovery itself would soon lead to even more uncomfortable revelations. As investigators delved deeper, they began to uncover more disturbing details about the circumstances surrounding the brain's removal and its subsequent preservation. The truth, it seemed, was far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. Not only was the man's brain preserved without his consent, but the entire process had been conducted in secret, under highly questionable circumstances. The records surrounding the procedure had been intentionally buried, kept out of the public eye, and hidden away within the classified files of a government institution. As the pieces began to come together, a chilling pattern emerged. The brain had been part of a larger, more nefarious scheme to advance medical research at any cost. The very notion of scientific progress had been used to justify a flagrant violation of personal autonomy. As word spread about the discovery, the public began to ask questions. Who was responsible for this? How had they justified such an act? Was this the norm in medical research at the time? What other secrets might be lurking in the hidden files of the medical institutions and government agencies that held these classified documents? The more the investigation uncovered, the more questions emerged, leading many to wonder if this was the beginning of a much darker and more complex story than they had initially realized. The brain, once considered just another specimen, had now become a symbol of something far more profound. It was a symbol of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition, of the ethical compromises that are often made in the pursuit of knowledge. It was also a stark reminder that, even in the face of progress, the rights and dignity of the individual should never be sacrificed for the sake of discovery. The discovery of this brain in 1912 was not just a shocking moment in the history of neuroscience. It was a moment that forced the world to confront the uncomfortable truths about the relationship between science, ethics, and humanity. As the investigation continued, new revelations would surface, shedding light on the full scope of this macabre story. The more the public learned about the brain's preservation, the more they realized that it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. What had begun as a simple discovery had evolved into a deep and unsettling exploration of the ways in which science had, and sometimes still does, pushed the boundaries of what is considered acceptable. And as the story of the preserved brain unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a tale of scientific curiosity. It was a tale of exploitation, secrecy, and moral ambiguity. A tale that would leave an indelible mark on the history of neuroscience, and a story that continues to resonate with us today. Boston in 1912 was a city straddling the cusp of monumental change. It was an era that saw the burgeoning of both scientific discovery and societal transformation, a time when the rush of progress was tinged with an underlying sense of unease. Medicine was advancing at an unprecedented rate, but with it came the creeping fear of what lay ahead. There was a palpable tension in the air, a tension between the excitement of new knowledge and the uncomfortable price that often had to be paid to acquire it. This was not just a time of discovery. It was also an era where the line between the acceptable and the unconscionable seemed to blur as medical practitioners pushed boundaries that are now, in hindsight, impossible to ignore. The early 20th century saw an explosion of interest in the human brain. Neurology was an up-and-coming field, still in its infancy but rapidly gaining ground in both academic and clinical settings. The brain, the very organ that dictated thoughts, memories, and actions, had long been a subject of fascination. Its mystery seemed endless, and every new discovery brought scientists closer to a more profound understanding of how it worked. But in a world where science had yet to catch up with modern ethical standards, there were few safeguards in place to prevent this drive for knowledge from overstepping moral boundaries. It was not uncommon for the human body, in death or even in life, to become an object of study without the consent of the individual or their family. This era, steeped in both optimism and dread, was a breeding ground for experiments that would seem unthinkable by today's standards. The foundations of modern neurology were being laid with a feverish intensity, but as the passion for understanding the brain took hold, so too did the willingness to violate the very people these discoveries were meant to serve. Science was not only about progress, it was also about power. Those who held knowledge wielded it like a weapon, and the subjects of their experiments often had no say in their fate. In Boston, a city known for its academic institutions and burgeoning medical community, the practice of brain dissection and preservation had already begun. At the time, Boston was home to some of the best medical schools in the country, where the latest techniques in dissection were being employed on human bodies. The medical community viewed these practices not with trepidation, but with a sense of necessary progress. They believed that to understand the complexities of the brain, they had to get their hands, quite literally, on it. The popular notion of the time was that knowledge could be extracted from the body like the contents of a jar, without considering the ethical implications of taking that which belonged to a person without their permission. The early 1900s were marked by a cultural and scientific climate in which the boundaries of medical experimentation were often pushed far beyond what was considered acceptable by today's standards. In many ways, this was a time when scientific curiosity was given free rein, unburdened by the constraints of human rights or moral considerations. The results were sometimes groundbreaking, but they often came at a steep price. Researchers had little regard for the autonomy of the subjects they studied, viewing them as tools rather than individuals. To them, The drive for knowledge was worth almost any sacrifice. The removal of human brains for study was not new in 1912, but what made the event in Boston so unsettling was not just the dissection itself, but the secrecy and the lack of consent involved. It was an open secret in medical circles that the brains of the deceased were often taken without the knowledge or approval of the deceased's family. Some researchers justified this by arguing that the preservation of brains was essential for the advancement of science, but that justification often seemed hollow in the face of the human cost. As the field of neuroscience developed, so did the need for more advanced preservation techniques. Early methods of preserving brains were crude at best. The challenge of keeping a brain intact for future study was formidable, as the organ was delicate and prone to decay. Preservation methods varied widely, from simple formaldehyde to more sophisticated techniques, but they all shared a fundamental flaw: they lacked the ethical considerations we take for granted today. In fact, many of the preserved brains from this period were not preserved for the purpose of furthering knowledge or advancing medical treatment. They were preserved to satisfy the curiosity of a few powerful individuals in the scientific community. The brain's preservation in Boston was part of a broader trend that was sweeping through the scientific world at the time. Throughout the United States and Europe, the brains of famous individuals, criminals, and even ordinary people were being collected and preserved for study. The logic behind this practice was simple. To understand the brain, scientists needed to examine it in its entirety. And the best way to do that was to acquire it, regardless of how the acquisition occurred. Yet, at the time, there was little backlash. The thirst for knowledge was so overwhelming that many simply overlooked the darker side of these scientific endeavors. The idea of obtaining a preserved brain was seen as the pinnacle of scientific achievement, a way to unlock the secrets of the human mind. But as with many scientific advancements, the consequences were not fully understood until much later. This lack of foresight would come to haunt the medical community as the scandals surrounding the preserved brain began to unfold. As the decades passed, the public would slowly learn of the unethical practices that had been employed to acquire the brain, and the consequences of those actions would reverberate throughout the scientific world. What was once seen as a necessary step in the pursuit of knowledge would eventually be understood as a dark chapter in the history of medical science. The tension that ran through Boston's medical community in 1912 was a microcosm of a larger global phenomenon. Around the world, the field of neuroscience was developing at breakneck speed, but so too was the recognition that these advancements were coming at a significant moral cost. The world was beginning to realize that science, while capable of producing incredible breakthroughs, also had the potential to be dangerously immoral. And nowhere was this more evident than in the case of the preserved brain. As Boston's scientific community continued its experiments, it was clear that the methods of the past could no longer be justified. The unchecked ambition that had fueled the preservation of the brain was beginning to look more and more like a reckless disregard for human dignity. But despite this, the pursuit of knowledge continued. The dark history of the preserved brain would remain hidden for many years, overshadowed by the excitement and promise of scientific progress. In the years following the discovery, the public would come to understand the implications of this unsettling event. It would spark a nationwide conversation about the ethics of scientific experimentation and the rights of individuals. But in 1912, those questions had yet to be asked. At the time, it was simply another chapter in the ongoing quest for knowledge, an event that, though disturbing, was ultimately seen as just another step toward understanding the complexities of the human brain. The ethical considerations that we now take for granted in the realm of scientific research were not yet fully formed. The concept of consent, particularly in the context of medical experimentation, was still in its infancy. It would take many years of reflection, legal battles, and societal pressure before the medical community began to implement the safeguards that we rely on today. But in 1912, Boston was a place where science and ethics had yet to find common ground, and the preserved brain was just another relic of a bygone era. It would take decades for the true implications of this discovery to be fully understood, but when they were, they would change the course of medical history forever. The man whose brain would eventually be preserved, dissected, and hidden away for decades was not just a nameless specimen, nor was his life an inconsequential footnote in the larger narrative of scientific discovery. He was a man who, in life, had his own story, his own identity, and his own struggles, yet his final resting place would be far removed from what he might have expected. His name was lost to time for many years, but the details of his existence would later emerge through fragments of records, whispers, and forgotten accounts. His life was entwined with a series of events that would come to symbolize the growing tension between scientific ambition and basic human rights. Yet, In the context of this narrative, his personal history and identity seemed almost secondary to the cold, scientific nature of what happened to him after his death. It is often the case that the lives of those at the center of such medical controversies are reduced to mere instruments in a larger experiment. And so it was with this man. But we must take a moment to pause and ask, who was he before he became the subject of medical intrigue? What kind of person lived in the body that would one day be dissected and preserved against his will? To fully grasp the tragedy of what happened, we need to consider the circumstances of his life, albeit the fragments we can piece together. The man in question was not a criminal, nor was he a prominent figure in society. He was, for all intents and purposes, an ordinary man, his life far from exceptional in the eyes of most. He had lived in the shadows of the bustling streets of early 20th century Boston, a city on the edge of scientific breakthroughs but still haunted by the old-world thinking that valued progress at any cost. The man was not someone who had voluntarily offered himself to science, nor did he leave behind a legacy that would make his name memorable in history books. But his fate was sealed when he crossed paths with a group of researchers eager to push the boundaries of what was possible in their field. The exact details of his life remain murky, perhaps because he was not a famous person, or perhaps because the records surrounding him were intentionally obscured. What is known is that he was not a part of any criminal case or medical anomaly that would have justified the public's fascination with his body. In fact, he was not even a patient of any special significance. The records indicate that he had been a relatively inconspicuous individual, someone whose death was of little consequence to those around him. But this very ordinariness would become the source of the ethical outrage that would arise once his brain was uncovered. What was truly unsettling, however, was not the man's life, but rather the lack of respect for his body once he was no longer alive. His brain was removed without permission, without a single word of consent from his family, and in a manner that was as invasive as it was impersonal. For a man who had likely lived a life defined by routine, toil, and perhaps unremarkable struggles, his death and the subsequent treatment of his body were anything but ordinary. It was as if his life had ceased to matter the moment he passed away, his humanity lost beneath the cold, sterile hands of those who saw him not as a person, but as a tool for scientific inquiry. At the time, the man's brain would have been seen by medical professionals as just another specimen, another part of the human body to be studied in the name of progress. There was a prevailing belief in the early 20th century that the dissection of human bodies, whether through autopsies or experimental procedures, was a necessary evil in the pursuit of scientific understanding. In fact, it was not an uncommon practice to collect human tissue without consent for the purposes of advancing medical knowledge. The rationale was simple. The greater good of scientific progress justified the use of human remains. But such a view ignored the deeply personal and ethical questions surrounding the treatment of human bodies, especially those of ordinary men and women who had no opportunity to decide their fate. What made the preservation of this man's brain particularly disturbing was the fact that he had never been given a choice. He had not been a willing participant in any scientific study, nor had he volunteered for the kind of research that would lead to his brain being preserved and analyzed. His body had been treated as a vessel for discovery, a means to an end for those who sought to unlock the mysteries of the human mind. The lack of consent in this case wasn't an anomaly. It was a reflection of a broader attitude in medical science at the time, an attitude that dehumanized the subjects of scientific experiments in favor of achieving greater knowledge. The details surrounding his death and the subsequent removal of his brain are, like much of his life, shrouded in mystery. It is unclear exactly how or why his brain was chosen, nor is there a clear record of who made the decision to preserve it. What is known is that the decision was made by a group of researchers, driven by their desire to contribute to the rapidly expanding field of neuroscience. At the time, the brain was still largely uncharted territory for medical professionals, and the idea of preserving it for future study was seen as an exciting and necessary step in the scientific process. But this enthusiasm for discovery came at a high cost, one that the man himself could never have anticipated. As his brain was preserved, dissected, and eventually hidden away in a jar, the man's body was stripped of its identity, reduced to a mere object for scientific experimentation. His life, once full of human complexity and experience, was now represented only by his brain, his mind preserved in a glass container, to be examined and studied like any other piece of scientific equipment. And yet, there was something deeply tragic about this transformation. The brain, once the center of his thoughts, his memories, and his essence, had become a lifeless object. It was no longer a part of him. It was an object of study, removed from its context and treated with a cold detachment that belied its former significance. It's crucial to understand that in the early 1900s, the concept of informed consent was not well established in the medical field, nor was there widespread awareness of the ethical principles that would later be codified in medical practice. This man's body, in death, became a victim of the times, caught between the ruthless drive of science and the absence of ethical oversight. His fate was decided not by his own hand, but by a group of men who, in their pursuit of knowledge, saw no moral quandary in treating him as a mere object for their research. As the years went by, the brain was preserved in secrecy. Its true nature remained hidden, and the man whose identity was largely forgotten continued to exist only as a name on a forgotten ledger, a name that would later become the center of controversy, but whose story was lost to the annals of time. The discovery of the preserved brain many years later would raise more questions than answers, forcing the world to confront not only the legacy of this forgotten man but also the uncomfortable truths about the ethical cost of scientific progress. The man's life may have seemed ordinary, his death a natural conclusion to his existence. But in death, his identity was obscured by the cold precision of medical science, his brain forever removed from the life it had once been a part of. He became a symbol, a cautionary tale of what happens when science crosses the line into exploitation, when knowledge is pursued at the cost of human dignity. His body, in the hands of those who saw it only as a specimen, became a reminder of the darker side of scientific ambition, a side that was all too willing to sacrifice individual rights for the sake of progress. The legacy of this man, whose life and death were so easily forgotten, would linger in the corridors of history as a stark reminder that even the most ordinary individuals are deserving of respect and autonomy. His story serves as a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition in the pursuit of knowledge, and a reminder that the value of a life cannot be reduced to the sum of its biological parts. The preservation of a human brain, particularly in the early 20th century, was no simple feat. It was a process that combined rudimentary techniques with a thirst for knowledge, and in many ways, it symbolized the crossroads between progress and the willingness to blur moral boundaries. At the time, the field of neuroscience was still in its infancy, and while the medical community was eager to understand the brain, perhaps the most complex organ in the human body, scientific methods had yet to develop the sophistication they would later achieve. Preserving a brain, especially one for study, was a complicated and uncertain endeavor. And yet, despite the challenges and the ethical implications, the practice of preserving human tissue for scientific inquiry was becoming increasingly common, particularly for those in the burgeoning field of neurology. In the case of the man whose brain would eventually be preserved in Boston, it wasn't merely a matter of simple preservation for the sake of posterity. No, what made this particular instance so shocking was not just the method used but the fact that it was done without consent. The very notion of taking a person's brain, an organ so intimately tied to identity, memory, and personality, and removing it for study was both groundbreaking and ethically dubious. But the scientists involved in this case, in 1912, would have seen it as a necessary sacrifice, a small price to pay in the pursuit of greater scientific understanding. The technique that was employed to preserve this man's brain was still in its early stages. Formaldehyde, a common preservative at the time, was used to keep the tissue intact, although its effectiveness in preventing decay was limited. The process of removing the brain itself was not unlike other forms of dissection, where the body was opened up, organs were removed, and then preserved for future examination. The brain, however, posed a unique challenge. Unlike other organs, it was delicate, with the potential for irreversible damage if not handled with extreme care. The protective membrane around the brain, the skull, had to be carefully removed, and the brain itself needed to be extracted without causing any unnecessary damage to its intricate structure. The precision required to preserve the brain intact was not easy, and the scientific community was still learning how best to accomplish it. The preservation itself was both an art and a science. The methods of the time often involved injecting formaldehyde or other chemicals directly into the brain tissue, with the aim of halting the natural decomposition process. The challenge was not just to preserve the organ for a short period of time, but to maintain it in a state where it could be studied and analyzed for years or even decades. It was a delicate balancing act. Too much chemical solution could damage the tissue, too little would allow decay to set in. The exacting process of brain preservation during this period was still a mix of trial and error, with little in the way of established protocols to guide the researchers. Every preserved brain was a unique experiment, and its condition would depend on the precision and foresight of the scientists handling it. One of the most important aspects of brain preservation at the time was the desire to uncover the mysteries of human cognition and behavior. The early neuroscientists of the 20th century were seeking answers to fundamental questions about the brain's function. What made humans different from other species? What caused certain mental illnesses? How did memories form? And what role did the brain play in personality and thought? These questions were more than academic. They were deeply personal to the researchers involved. For many of them, uncovering the secrets of the brain was a holy grail of scientific inquiry, and the methods used to explore it, however ethically questionable, were justified by the potential discoveries they could lead to. The fact that this particular brain was chosen for preservation is a testament to the way the scientific community viewed its subjects during this period. While some may have considered the removal and preservation of human organs as invasive and unethical, many in the medical and scientific communities saw it as an essential part of progress. The brain was viewed as the last frontier in human biology, and unlocking its secrets could lead to profound advances in medicine, psychology, and even philosophy. The preservation of human brains was not uncommon in the early 1900s, especially among the famous and the infamous, as researchers sought to understand the connections between brain structure and behavior. What made this case so troubling was that the man whose brain was preserved was not a criminal or a well-known historical figure. He was, in fact, an ordinary individual whose only real distinction was that his body became the subject of an experiment. To the researchers involved, his brain represented not the sum of a unique life, but merely a piece of tissue that could be studied, dissected, and analyzed for insights into the workings of the human mind. The ethics of such a practice were hardly questioned at the time. Science had a way of justifying itself, particularly when it was seen as a means to achieve great discoveries that would benefit society as a whole. The ethical concerns surrounding this man's brain, once it was preserved, grew more pressing as the years went by. Was it right to remove a person's brain without consent, to treat them as an object for scientific scrutiny? For the scientists of the time, this was not a question that weighed heavily on their minds. They were focused on advancing their field, on uncovering the mysteries of the brain, and they believed that this could only be achieved through experimentation, sometimes at the cost of personal autonomy. The decision to preserve this man's brain, in their view, was a necessary step in the pursuit of scientific progress. They were not motivated by malice or cruelty, but by a fervent belief that the end justified the means. Yet, with the passage of time, the nature of the preservation came under scrutiny. Once the brain was discovered years later, hidden away in the dusty corners of a Boston medical facility, the implications of what had been done became impossible to ignore. What had been seen as a harmless, even admirable act of scientific curiosity at the time, now looked more like a violation of the man's body, his rights, and his dignity. The brain that had once been a symbol of potential discovery was now a symbol of exploitation. It had been taken from someone who had no chance to agree to its removal, treated as a mere object for study rather than as a part of a person. In a way, the very process of brain preservation represented a contradiction. While the goal was to preserve the brain for future study, in doing so, the essence of what made a human, the thoughts, memories, and consciousness it contained, was lost. The brain was now a cold, lifeless object, preserved in a jar, its original function as the seat of the mind irrelevant to its current state. It was a symbol of the clash between scientific progress and the intrinsic value of human life. By preserving the brain, the scientists had achieved a form of progress, but at the same time, they had stripped the brain of the very thing that made it meaningful, its connection to a living, breathing human being. As the preservation of this brain became more widely known, it raised questions that extended far beyond the specifics of this one case. How many other brains had been preserved in this way, taken from those who never had a say in the matter? How many scientific advances had been made at the expense of personal autonomy? The case of this one man's brain opened up a larger conversation about the ethics of scientific experimentation, about the moral obligations that researchers had to the people whose bodies they studied. In many ways, the process of preserving the brain was more than just a technical challenge. It was an ethical minefield. The scientists involved in this particular case, like many of their contemporaries, had no way of foreseeing how their actions would be viewed by future generations. They believed that their work would be remembered for the discoveries it would lead to, not for the lives it might have cost. And yet, in the end, the preserved brain became a symbol of the darker side of scientific ambition, a side that was willing to sacrifice individual rights and dignity for the sake of progress. What began as an act of scientific curiosity in 1912 eventually became a cautionary tale, forcing us to reflect on the balance between knowledge and ethics. The preservation of this brain, though a remarkable achievement from a scientific standpoint, was also a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. It raised questions that are still relevant today. about the lengths to which science should go in the pursuit of knowledge and the boundaries that should never be crossed in the name of progress. The discovery of the preserved brain, tucked away in the forgotten recesses of a Boston medical institution, was more than just an academic curiosity. It was a moment that cracked open the door to uncomfortable truths about the nature of medical research, the power dynamics within the scientific community, and the disregard for human dignity that sometimes accompanied the pursuit of knowledge. As the details surrounding the preservation of this brain began to unravel, they painted a picture of a scientific community operating with a sense of privilege, where ethical concerns were often sidelined in favor of progress. But it wasn't just the act of preserving a brain without consent that would come to light. It was the broader pattern of secrecy, exploitation, and ethical blindness that had guided much of early scientific exploration. The story of this preserved brain revealed a much larger, much darker narrative of scientific ambition and its tendency to overlook the rights of the individuals who became its subjects. When the preserved brain was discovered years later, it wasn't just the scientific community that was shocked, it was the world at large. The revelation exposed a grave ethical violation and opened up a deep conversation about the rights of individuals and the responsibility of scientists. How could something like this happen? How could a human being be reduced to an object for study, stripped of their identity, autonomy, and dignity? And more importantly, why had no one questioned the practices of medical researchers at the time, especially in an era when ethical considerations were beginning to gain prominence in other fields? The answer, as it would turn out, lay in the very culture of science itself during the early 1900s, a culture in which the ends often justified the means, and the thirst for knowledge was seen as more important than the means of acquiring it. During this time, medical institutions were still operating under the assumption that the pursuit of scientific knowledge was the highest good. There was little regulation, and even less oversight when it came to the ways in which human bodies were treated within the medical community. This lack of regulation allowed researchers to justify their actions in the name of progress, and in many ways, it created an environment where the ethics of their methods were seldom questioned. The concept of informed consent, the idea that individuals should have the right to give or withhold their permission for their bodies to be used in experiments, was not fully developed. While this idea had begun to take root in some parts of the world, it had not yet gained widespread acceptance within the scientific community. In fact, the preservation of human brains without consent was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the larger, more pervasive culture of scientific experimentation that often disregarded the autonomy of the individuals involved. In the case of the preserved brain, it was clear that the people involved had viewed the subject not as a human being but as a means to an end. The brain was removed, preserved, and tucked away without any regard for the man's identity or his right to privacy. The very notion that someone's brain could be treated as an object, a specimen to be studied and examined without permission, highlighted a deep-seated problem within the medical field. In the eyes of those conducting the research, the man's identity had been erased the moment he passed away. He was no longer a person, he was merely a tool for scientific advancement. And it wasn't just the removal of his brain that was troubling, it was the fact that it was done so quietly, so secretly, without the knowledge or consent of his family or the broader public. The preservation of this brain was not only a violation of personal rights, but also a reflection of a wider societal blind spot when it came to medical ethics. One of the most disturbing aspects of this story is the fact that, for a long time, the preservation of the brain went unnoticed by the wider public. The secrecy surrounding its removal and subsequent preservation was indicative of how easily scientific institutions could operate in the shadows, away from public scrutiny. At the time, the scientific community was highly insulated from the general public. Institutions like hospitals and universities often held a great deal of power, and the work being conducted within them was rarely questioned. There was a widespread trust in science, an almost reverential belief that the pursuit of knowledge was always good, always beneficial, and always conducted with the highest moral standards. This faith in science, combined with a lack of oversight, allowed for abuses to go unchecked, as those in positions of authority were rarely challenged. When the brain was eventually discovered, it became clear that what had been a common and accepted practice within the scientific community was, in retrospect, a deep moral failure. It wasn't just that the man's brain had been taken without permission, it was that the very act of doing so had been justified by a belief in the sanctity of scientific progress. The preservation of this brain, far from being a singular, isolated incident, represented the larger, systemic issues within the field of neuroscience and medicine at the time. It was a reflection of the ways in which the pursuit of knowledge could sometimes cloud judgment, leading to the dehumanization of individuals who were treated as little more than vessels for discovery. And as the truth about the preserved brain emerged, it also shed light on the broader pattern of secrecy and exploitation that had often been the foundation of scientific advancement. This pattern of secrecy in scientific research wasn't limited to this particular case. Throughout history, there have been numerous instances where human beings have been subjected to experiments without their knowledge or consent. In many cases, these experiments were conducted by respected medical institutions, often with the belief that they were for the greater good. And in some instances, these experiments led to groundbreaking scientific discoveries. But the fact that these discoveries were made at the expense of individual autonomy and human dignity is a stain on the history of science, a stain that is only now beginning to be fully acknowledged and addressed. The story of the preserved brain in Boston serves as a stark reminder of the ethical compromises that can arise when science is pursued without a moral framework. It highlights the dangers of unquestioning faith in scientific progress and the need for vigilance when it comes to protecting human rights within the realm of research. But it also serves as a catalyst for change. The ethical failings surrounding the preservation of this brain, and the subsequent discovery of the truth, prompted a larger conversation about the rights of individuals in scientific research. It forced the scientific community to confront uncomfortable truths about the practices that had been so common for so long. As the scandal surrounding the preserved brain unfolded, the public's trust in the medical community was shaken. People began to question how many other bodies had been used in experiments without consent, how many other brains had been preserved in the name of progress. The discovery of this particular brain opened a Pandora's box, revealing just how far medical science had been willing to go in the pursuit of knowledge. It was no longer just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that had been allowed to persist for far too long. And as the full scope of this pattern came to light, it became clear that the preservation of this brain was not merely a violation of a single person's rights, it was a violation of the trust between science and society. The power dynamics at play in this story are equally important to understand. The scientists who had preserved the brain operated with a sense of authority that allowed them to treat human bodies as objects for study. Their status, their position within respected institutions, and the widespread reverence for scientific progress gave them a certain privilege, one that allowed them to overlook the rights of the individuals whose bodies they work with. This privilege, deeply embedded in the hierarchical structures of early 20th century medical institutions, fostered a culture of unchecked experimentation and moral blindness. Those in positions of power had the ability to shape the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in scientific research, and they often did so without considering the broader implications of their actions. The story of the preserved brain is not just the story of one man's fate, it is a reflection of a larger societal issue, one that forced us to confront the darker side of scientific ambition. It challenged us to reconsider how we view progress, ethics, and human rights in the context of research. It was a moment that sparked a conversation about consent, autonomy, and the inherent value of human life, forcing us to reckon with the history of scientific experimentation that often took place at the expense of the individual. And as we continue to move forward in the field of science, we are reminded that the pursuit of knowledge must always be balanced with respect for the very people who make that knowledge possible. The story of the preserved brain serves as a cautionary tale, a lesson learned the hard way, one that continues to resonate in the ethical debates of the present day. The moment the preserved brain came to light, it did more than just spark a moral and scientific controversy. It became a pivotal event that forced society to re-evaluate its relationship with science and the ethical boundaries of medical research. The unearthed brain, concealed for decades in a medical institution, was not merely a relic of an outdated practice. It was a living testament to the ways in which scientific progress, once seen as infallible, had collided with personal rights, human dignity, and the evolving understanding of what it means to treat people with respect. But beyond the surface of the discovery, the real questions that emerged from this scandal were far deeper and more complex. How could something like this happen? How could an individual's body, something so intimately tied to their sense of self, be so easily reduced to an object of study, an artifact to be preserved for the benefit of science? And more importantly, why did it take so long for society to recognize the ethical breaches of such practices? In the early 20th century, the relationship between science and society was far more opaque than it is today. Science was regarded almost with reverence, a pursuit that was seen as inherently noble, a force for progress, and an engine of social change. But while this was true to some extent, it also created an environment in which the people conducting experiments were often given the benefit of the doubt, their actions unchecked by the moral standards that are now integral to modern research practices. The men and women who sought to understand the human brain, the mind, and the mysteries of consciousness were often seen as the intellectual elite, the vanguard of human knowledge. Their discoveries were valued above all else, and their methods, however questionable, were excused for the greater good. This reverence for science, combined with the prevailing lack of regulation, allowed practices like brain preservation without consent to go unnoticed and unchallenged. As the details surrounding the discovery of the brain began to emerge, it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident, nor was it a mistake made by a single rogue researcher. This was the product of a culture, a system, that had allowed such practices to flourish without oversight. Researchers had become so immersed in their pursuit of knowledge that they failed to recognize the ethical implications of their actions. For them, the body was simply a vessel for the mind, and the mind itself was the only thing worth studying. The preservation of a brain was seen as a valuable scientific achievement, a rare and necessary step in the exploration of human consciousness. But in the pursuit of that knowledge, they had disregarded the fundamental rights of the person whose brain had been preserved. The more one delves into the historical context of this incident, the more it becomes apparent that the preservation of the brain was not just a lapse in ethical judgment, it was emblematic of a larger societal attitude towards the human body and the people it belonged to. In the early 20th century, people's bodies were often seen as instruments for scientific advancement, their autonomy disregarded in favor of progress. The very notion that someone's brain could be removed and preserved without their consent was rooted in the belief that science could justify any means, as long as the outcome was considered valuable. In this sense, the scientists involved in the preservation of the brain had likely justified their actions by focusing solely on the potential contributions to neuroscience, without considering the personal rights of the individual who had died. But as the years passed and public opinion shifted, the ethical implications of the discovery became impossible to ignore. The brain, once seen as a valuable specimen, had now become a symbol of exploitation. It was a stark reminder that scientific progress cannot and should not come at the cost of human dignity. It forced society to confront the uncomfortable reality that, in the rush to uncover the secrets of the human mind, the very people whose minds they sought to understand had been violated. And as the true nature of the brain's preservation became public knowledge, it sparked a widespread conversation about consent, ethics, and the ways in which the scientific community must be held accountable for its actions. This discovery not only raised questions about medical ethics but also exposed a dangerous blind spot in the scientific community itself. For decades, scientists had been working in an environment where ethical guidelines were, at best, underdeveloped and, at worst, non-existent. The field of neuroscience, in particular, had been growing rapidly, and with this growth came a sense of unchecked ambition. The scientists involved in the preservation of the brain had likely seen their work as groundbreaking, as crucial to the advancement of knowledge. But their singular focus on scientific achievement had blinded them to the very real human costs associated with their actions. At the heart of the controversy was the issue of consent, the right of an individual to control what happens to their body, both in life and in death. The preservation of the brain without the consent of the man or his family was a violation of this basic right. It was a betrayal of trust, a failure to recognize that the body, even after death, belongs to the individual, not to the scientific community. The discovery of the brain forced the public to grapple with the fact that, for all its promises of progress, science had a dark side, a side that was willing to sacrifice human rights in the name of discovery. But perhaps the most striking consequence of the discovery was the way it illuminated the power dynamics that existed within the scientific community. The people who had removed and preserved this brain were not isolated figures working in secret. They were part of a broader academic and medical establishment, one that held significant influence and was trusted by society to act in the best interest of humanity. And yet, despite their position of power, they had abused that trust, exploiting the body of a deceased individual in the name of knowledge. This abuse of power was not unique to this particular incident. It was reflective of a broader pattern within the scientific community, where researchers were often granted an almost unchecked authority over their subjects. This sense of entitlement, combined with the lack of oversight, allowed for ethical boundaries to be crossed with little fear of reprisal. As the brain's preservation came to light, it became clear that what had once been a widely accepted practice within the scientific community was, in hindsight, a grave violation. The incident forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that scientific progress, while undoubtedly important, could never justify the mistreatment of human beings. The brain, once a symbol of intellectual curiosity and scientific achievement, had become a symbol of exploitation and disregard for human dignity. The public reaction to the discovery of the brain was swift and intense. People were horrified that such a violation had occurred without their knowledge, and that a human life could be reduced to little more than an object for study. The story of the brain's preservation became a rallying cry for those who sought to establish ethical guidelines within the scientific community, calling for stricter regulations and greater accountability. It was a wake-up call, a moment that forced the world to recognize the inherent value of human life, even after death. The incident would lead to widespread reforms in the way research was conducted, particularly in terms of consent and the treatment of human subjects. One of the most important lessons that emerged from the controversy surrounding the preserved brain was the realization that science cannot exist in a vacuum, detached from the ethical considerations that govern society as a whole. Science, while a powerful tool for discovery and progress, must always be tempered by a sense of responsibility to the individuals who make that discovery possible and to the broader society that benefits from it. The preservation of the brain was a stark reminder that scientific knowledge cannot, and should not, come at the expense of personal autonomy and dignity. The story of this brain, hidden away in a jar for decades, serves as a cautionary tale, one that urges us to always question the price of progress and to ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never leads us to lose sight of the human beings who make that knowledge possible. As the years have gone by, the legacy of this discovery has continued to resonate in the conversations surrounding medical ethics, human rights, and the boundaries of scientific research. The questions it raised about consent, autonomy, and the ethical treatment of human subjects remain as relevant today as they were when the preserved brain was first discovered. And while the scientific community has made great strides in addressing these concerns, the lessons learned from this dark chapter in the history of neuroscience serve as a constant reminder that the pursuit of knowledge must always be tempered by a deep respect for the lives it touches. The preserved brain, once a symbol of scientific curiosity, has come to represent something far more profound, a reflection of the need to balance progress with ethics, to never lose sight of the humanity behind the science. The discovery of the preserved brain and the subsequent revelations surrounding its origins created ripples that extended far beyond the academic and scientific circles in which it had been concealed for so many years. This seemingly isolated event became a defining moment in the history of medical ethics and human rights, a moment that would force society to examine the darker corners of scientific exploration. What was once a seemingly innocuous practice, preserving the human brain for study, quickly transformed into a scandal that questioned the very foundation of the relationship between science, society, and the body. As this brain, trapped in time and memory, came to light, it exposed the ways in which scientific ambition could blur the lines between discovery and exploitation. The gravity of the situation lay not just in the violation of one individual's rights, but in the larger implications it held for the medical and scientific communities. The act of preserving a human brain without the consent of the individual or their family was an ethical breach that reverberated across disciplines. It highlighted the pervasive disregard for human dignity that had been allowed to fester in an era where science was held in almost sacred reverence. The greater scientific community, once united in the pursuit of knowledge, found itself divided, with some defending the practice as a necessary sacrifice for progress, while others began to recognize it for the violation that it was. This division sparked a broader societal debate about the limits of scientific exploration and the balance between human rights and the thirst for knowledge. For many decades, the scientific community had operated under the belief that knowledge was an absolute good. The idea that human bodies, whether living or deceased, could be used as tools for scientific advancement was not just accepted. It was often seen as a moral imperative. The minds of some of the most prominent researchers of the time were consumed with the pursuit of unlocking the mysteries of the brain. To them, every advancement, every preserved organ, every experiment, was a step closer to understanding what made humans who they were. But the cost of these discoveries, as exemplified by this man's brain, was much higher than they had anticipated. At the heart of this scandal was the central issue of consent, the ethical principle that a person must have the right to decide what happens to their body, both in life and death, had not been fully integrated into medical practices at the time. The concept of informed consent, though gradually gaining traction in other areas of medicine, was still far from being a universal practice in the early 20th century. This lack of awareness or consideration for the rights of individuals became especially evident when researchers chose to remove and preserve the brain of this particular man without his consent. It was as though his body was nothing more than an object, a vessel to be used in the name of scientific inquiry, with no regard for the sanctity of his personhood. This issue of consent was not just about a single individual's rights. It was about the broader question of who had control over the body, both in life and death. By removing and preserving the brain without the man's consent, the scientists involved had taken away his autonomy, the very essence of his humanity. In a sense, the brain had ceased to be a part of him. It was no longer the seat of his consciousness, his thoughts, or his identity. It had been reduced to an object, preserved for dissection and study. What remained of the man's humanity was now contained in an object on a shelf, its potential for discovery out of his reach, disconnected from the life it had once sustained. The practice of preserving human tissue for scientific study had long been an accepted, if controversial, part of the scientific process. From autopsies to anatomical studies, medical research had often relied on the dissection and preservation of human remains. But what made this particular case stand out was the fact that the brain in question had been preserved without consent. In this case, the man had no say in his fate after death, no opportunity to make his wishes known, to give permission or deny the use of his body for scientific purposes. In the absence of consent, the moral foundations of medical practice crumbled. What was once viewed as an important tool for scientific progress now became a reminder of the moral blindness that had allowed such practices to go unchallenged for so long. The lack of transparency surrounding the preservation of the brain only heightened the sense of betrayal. For years, the brain was kept in relative obscurity, hidden away in medical institutions, its origins a mystery to all but a few. Those who had taken part in its preservation had done so without informing the family, without leaving a trace of evidence to suggest that the man's body had been used for such a purpose. It was as though the individual had been erased from history, his body transformed into a mere specimen, a nameless object to be studied at the whim of researchers. It was only after the brain was discovered that the full extent of the breach became clear. And by that point, the man's identity had been lost, his story untold, leaving the world to ponder not only the rights of the individual but also the power dynamics that had made this violation possible. The medical and scientific communities, which had once been united in their pursuit of knowledge, now found themselves at a crossroads. The discovery of the preserved brain forced a reckoning. How could they continue to justify these kinds of practices? How could they reconcile the pursuit of knowledge with the responsibility they had to those whose bodies they studied? Some members of the scientific community defended the practice, arguing that it was done in the name of progress, that the preservation of the brain had contributed to important discoveries and advancements. But as more details about the case came to light, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the ethical ramifications of this argument. The debate over the preservation of the brain was not simply a theoretical exercise. It was a deeply personal issue for the family of the deceased man, who had never been consulted about the use of his body for research. Their grief and anger were compounded by the realization that their loved one's body had been violated in such an intimate and permanent way. They had no say in the matter, no opportunity to ensure that his body was treated with the respect it deserved. This lack of control over the fate of their loved one's remains was an affront to their sense of justice and decency. The public's reaction to the discovery of the brain was swift and profound. People from all walks of life felt the sting of this violation, the sense that something deeply wrong had occurred. The violation of one man's body had become a symbol of a larger issue, the growing recognition that medical research could no longer be conducted without considering the rights of the individuals involved. The question of consent, long overlooked in many areas of medical practice, had finally come to the forefront. And it was clear that the scientific community could no longer operate in isolation, detached from the moral considerations that governed the broader society. The scandals surrounding the preserved brain prompted changes that would eventually lead to the establishment of more stringent ethical guidelines in medical research. As the ethical failures of this case became more widely recognized, it fueled the movement toward reform within the scientific community. Informed consent became an increasingly important issue, with researchers and medical practitioners alike recognizing the need to obtain permission before using human bodies or tissues for research purposes. This moment in history marked the beginning of a larger conversation about the treatment of human subjects, one that would lay the groundwork for the ethical standards that govern modern medical research today. But the implications of the preserved brain went beyond the immediate changes in scientific practice. It forced a societal reckoning with the role of science in our lives. Science, long viewed as a force for good, was now being scrutinized for the ways in which it had sometimes trampled on the rights and dignity of the individuals it sought to understand. The case of the preserved brain became a symbol of the dangers that arose when the pursuit of knowledge was allowed to overshadow the basic ethical principles that should govern all human interactions. It reminded society that progress must always be tempered by compassion, that knowledge should never come at the expense of respect for human life.